People always ask me the same thing when they first see the property. They slow their truck down at the end of Ridgeback Road where the pavement gives up and the gravel starts, and they look through the tree line, and they say something like, "Who lives back there?" Like it's a riddle. Like the land itself is hiding someone. I'll tell you who lives back there, I do. My name is Emmett Dalton. I've been the sheriff of Harlan County for going on 11 years now, and before that I was a deputy for 9. 20 years wearing a badge in a place where people still settle arguments on their own porches and only call the law when the argument gets loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I know every back road, every hunting trail, every family name that goes back more than 2 generations. This county is in my blood the same way iron is in the well water. The property at the end of Ridgeback Road is 42 acres. My grandfather bought the first 20 in 1961 with cash money he earned, running a sawmill operation out near Denton Creek. My father added the back 22 in the 80s when the Purcell family moved to Lexington and let the land go for a song. I grew up on that dirt, built forts in those trees, shot my first deer about 200 yards from where my bedroom window is now. The house itself. That came later. After my wife Laura passed in 2016, I didn't know what to do with myself for about a year and a half. Grief does that. It makes you sit still in places that used to feel like home until they don't feel like anything at all. I was living in our old ranch house, closer to town, and every room had her voice in it, and I couldn't breathe right. So I built. I took the insurance money and the savings, and I hired a crew out of Knoxville, and I built a house on the family land. It took 14 months, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a detached workshop, and enough windows facing east that the morning light fills every room like water filling a glass. The whole thing appraised at just over $3 million when it was finished, which sounds like a lot of money until you understand that most of that value is the land itself. 42 acres of old hardwood forest with a spring-fed creek and no neighbors within shouting distance. That's worth something. That's worth everything if you're the kind of person who needs quiet to stay sane. And I am that kind of person. For 3 years, I lived out there in something close to peace. I'd drive the 26 minutes into town for my shifts, do my work, come home, sit on that porch with a cup of coffee and listen to absolutely nothing. Bob White's in the evening. Coyotes, way off in the distance sometimes. Wind through the hickories. That was my life, and I had made my peace with it being a small life, and I was grateful. Then the development came. They broke ground on what they called Ridgeback Estates in the spring of 2022. 140 homes on 110 acres, carved right out of the old Dawson farm that bordered my property to the north and west. Cookie-cutter houses, 3 models to choose from, 2-car garages, and a homeowners association with bylaws thicker than a phone book. They built a stone entrance with gold lettering and a little guardhouse that nobody ever sat in. They put in a community pool and a walking trail that looped around a man-made pond they stocked with catfish. And just like that, I had neighbors. Now I want to be fair here. Most of the people who moved into Ridgeback Estates were perfectly fine. Young families, retirees, a few folks who worked remotely and wanted more space. Regular people living regular lives. I had no quarrel with any of them, but there was one. There is always one. I found it on a Tuesday, folded once, tucked into a plastic sleeve, zip-tied to the iron rail of my front gate like somebody was serving me papers, which, in a manner of speaking, I suppose they were. Now let me back up and tell you something about my gate. It sits at the end of a gravel road that forks off County Route 9, about 40 yards past a stand of white oaks that have been growing there since before anyone in this county kept records. The gate itself is nothing fancy. Black iron, double swing, with a simple latch mechanism I installed myself the year I bought the property. No intercom, no camera at that point, just a gate and a mailbox, and a whole lot of quiet. I'd been out since before dawn that morning. We had a situation over in the eastern part of the county involving a property dispute between 2 brothers and a tractor that one of them may or may not have driven through the other one's chicken house. Was pushing 2 in the afternoon, and I was pushing 2 in the afternoon, and I hadn't eaten since a gas station coffee, and a granola bar that tasted like compressed sawdust. So I almost missed it. I was reaching out the truck window to unlatch the gate when the plastic sleeve caught the light and I saw the paper inside. I figured it was a flyer. We get those sometimes. Somebody selling firewood or advertising a church fish fry. I pulled it out, unfolded it, and read it right there with my truck idling and the gate half open. It was a letter. Typed. Not handwritten. At the top was a logo I'd never seen before. Pinewood Heritage Estates. Homeowners Association, it said, with a little graphic of a pine tree inside a shield. Underneath that, in bold, it read, Notice of Non-Compliance. I want to tell you what went through my mind, but honestly, the first thing I felt was just confusion. I'd lived on this land for 11 years. Bought it from the Callaway estate after old Mr. Callaway passed, and his kids wanted nothing to do with acreage they'd have to maintain. 18 acres, a creek, a house I'd spent the better part of 3 years renovating with my own hands, and a rotating crew of friends who owed me favors. I knew every inch of that property the way you know the layout of your own kitchen in the dark. And I had never, not once, heard of the Pinewood Heritage Estates Homeowners Association. The letter informed me that my property had been observed to be in violation of several community standards. It listed 4 items. The first was the condition of my front gate, which was described as inconsistent with the approved aesthetic guidelines. The second was an unauthorized structure, which I later figured out meant my tool shed. The third was improper vegetation management, which I believe was their way of saying I had tall grass in my east field. The fourth was failure to submit an architectural review request for recent modifications to the home exterior. At the bottom it said I had 30 days to remedy these violations, or face fines beginning at $250 per infraction per week. It was signed by the president of the board, a name I didn't recognize then, but would come to know very well. Margaret Bellwether. I sat there in my truck for a good long minute. Read it again. Then I folded it back up, tucked it into my shirt pocket, pulled through the gate, latched it behind me, and drove up to the house. I set the letter on my kitchen table next to my badge and my service weapon, which is where I put them every day when I come home. Then I made myself a sandwich and I thought about it. Somebody had walked onto my road, up to my gate, and zip-tied a violation notice to my property. Somebody who didn't know me. Somebody who hadn't done their homework. That was their first mistake. The dogs heard her before I did. Both of them lifted their heads off the porch boards at the same time, ears forward, that low rumble starting in Duke's chest, the way it does when someone's coming up the drive uninvited. I set my coffee down and waited. A white Lexus SUV came crawling up the gravel like it owned the place. Took its sweet time, too. Pulled right up past the gate I'd left open for the feed delivery and parked diagonal across my front turnaround like it was a shopping mall. I watched a woman get out, look at my house, look at my land, and then look at my house again with the kind of expression people make when they're already composing the complaint in their head. She was mid-50s, blonde highlights, sunglasses pushed up on top of her head even though it was overcast, linen pants, a clipboard. Lord help me. She had a clipboard. I stayed in my chair. Duke and Sadie stayed on the porch. Nobody moved. Way people smile when they're about to. Way people smile when they're about to tell you something they think you don't know. Good morning. I'm looking for the property owner. You found him. Wonderful. My name is Linda Meacham. I'm the president of the Ridgewood Crossing Homeowners Association. She said it the way some people say they're with the government. Like the title alone should rearrange your posture. I took a sip of coffee. Okay. She waited for more. Didn't get it. So she pressed on. I sent a letter last week regarding some concerns the board has identified with this property. I wanted to follow up in person since we didn't hear back. I got the letter, and I read it. Another pause. She shifted the clipboard from one arm to the other. I could see papers clipped to it, printed out neat, highlighted in 2 colors. Your property falls within the Ridgewood Crossing HOA jurisdiction. There are covenants, conditions, and restrictions that apply to every parcel in this development. And frankly, There are a number of issues we need to address, such as, she looked down at the clipboard like she'd been waiting for that exact prompt. The fencing along your south boundary is not an approved style. Your outbuilding exceeds the square footage allowance without a variance on file. There are 2 unregistered vehicles visible from the road, and your landscaping does not meet the community aesthetic standards, specifically the natural growth along the front easement. She meant my wildflowers, the ones my wife planted the year before she passed. I let that sit for a second. Then I said, anything else? There's also the matter of the dogs. Ridgewood Crossing has a 2-pet policy, and both animals need to be registered with the association and current on vaccination documentation submitted to our office. Duke yawned, big, wide, unbothered. Ms. Meacham. Linda, please. Ms. Meacham. I've lived on this property for 19 years. I built the house. I built the outbuilding. I put in that fence with my own hands, and I'm not in your HOA. She smiled again. Patient. Condescending. The kind of smile that says, I've done this before and you're going to lose. I understand it can feel that way, but the covenants were recorded with the county when the development was platted. They run with the land. It doesn't matter when you built or how long you've been here. The obligation is attached to the parcel. She said it like she was reading from a script she'd memorized, and maybe she was. Maybe she'd said those exact words to a dozen other people on this road and watched them fold. She pulled a sheet off the clipboard and held it out to me. This is a formal notice of violations. You have 30 days to come into compliance or the board will begin the fine process. I took the paper, folded it once, set it under my coffee mug. I appreciate you driving out, I said. You have a good day now. She stood there a moment longer than she should have. Then she turned and walked back to the Lexus. She'd be back. I knew that. People like Linda Meacham don't hear a quiet no. They only hear the loud ones. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because that's the day Marla runs the mail out to my box at the end of the gravel drive, and she always leaves it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker with a little sticky note if anything looks important. This one had a sticky note that said, yikes, with a frowning face. Official notice of violation. Property at 1847 Ridgecrest Lane. Failure to maintain front-facing landscaping in accordance with Section 4.2.1 of the Ridgecrest Commons Homeowners Association Architectural Standards. Fine assessed, $250. Payment due within 30 days. I read it twice standing there in my uniform because I'd just come off a 12-hour shift, and my boots were still on and my coffee was still brewing, and I genuinely thought someone had sent it to the wrong address. My landscaping. The landscaping I'd paid a licensed arborist $11,000 to design around the natural tree line so it would look like nobody had touched it. That landscaping. The second envelope came the following Tuesday. Violation of Section 6.1.3. Unapproved exterior structure. The structure in question was my mailbox. The cedar post mailbox that had been standing at the end of my drive for 9 years, which is 3 years longer than the HOA had existed in any form. Fine, $250. The third came the Tuesday after that. Section 3.7. Unapproved vehicle storage visible from the common roadway. They meant my department-issued Tahoe, the one with the light bar and the county seal on the door. Parked in my own driveway, on my own property, behind my own gate, which you could only see if you stood on the shoulder of the road and leaned sideways, and really committed to looking. Fine, $500 for that one. Repeat offender surcharge. I laid all three out on the kitchen table, and I looked at them the way I look at case files. Not with anger, not yet. With the part of my brain that asks, what's the pattern, and who benefits, and where's this going? Every single notice had the same signature at the bottom. Karen Del Vecchio, President, Ridgecrest Commons, HOA Board of Directors. The title was typed in bold like it was supposed to mean something constitutional. Now, here's what you need to understand. I had never joined this HOA. I had never signed a membership agreement. I had never attended a meeting, paid a due, or received a welcome packet. When I bought my property, it was unincorporated county land with no deed restrictions and no covenants on file. I know this because I'm the kind of person who reads every page of a closing document, and I'm also the kind of person who has access to the county recorder's office because it is literally down the hall from where I work. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I drove down to the recorder's office on my lunch break, and I pulled every document associated with my parcel. Every easement, every plat amendment, every filing going back to 1987, and there was nothing, no covenant, no declaration, no annexation agreement. My property was not part of Ridgecrest Commons. It had never been part of Ridgecrest Commons. The subdivision plat that created the HOA explicitly excluded my parcel because it predated the development by 40 years. I also pulled the HOA's own declaration of covenants, just to be thorough. Read the whole thing, sitting at my desk eating a turkey sandwich. And you know what I found in Article 2, Section 2.1, the section that defines which properties are subject to the association's authority? A legal description that drew a boundary line right along the eastern edge of my fence. My land was outside it, clearly, unambiguously, by their own documents. Karen Del Vecchio had been finding a property she had no jurisdiction over, and she'd been doing it on purpose because I'd already told her once where my property line was, and she'd smiled and said we'd see about that. So I stopped smiling too. The meeting was called for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, which told me everything I needed to know about how serious they thought this was. Emergency sessions don't get scheduled during prime time unless somebody wants an audience. Karen wanted an audience. I found out about it the way I found out about most things in Cedar Bluff Estates. Through Mitch Garvey, who lived 3 lots down and had the peculiar habit of walking his dog past every mailbox in the subdivision, like he was running a private intelligence service. Mitch called me at 4 in the afternoon, voice low like he was reporting enemy movement. They posted it on the community board an hour ago. Special session. Your property is the only item on the agenda. I thanked Mitch and told him I'd be there. He asked if I needed backup. I told him I just needed him to save me a seat. The community center for Cedar Bluff Estates was a stone and timber building near the front entrance that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine about places where people pay too much to live near other people they don't particularly like. I'd been inside it exactly twice. Once for the welcome reception when I first bought the property, and once when I ducked in to use the restroom during a long run. Both times, it smelled like carpet cleaner and quiet resentment. When I walked in at 6:55, the room was already more than half full. 30, maybe 35 residents seated in folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a long table at the front. Behind that table sat the board, 5 members. Karen Delacroix in the center chair, which I noted was slightly taller than the others. I'm not making that up. She had actually sourced a different chair. To her left sat Phil Weston, the treasurer, who sold commercial insurance and had the energy of a man who had been tired since 1997. Next to Phil was Diane Okafor, the secretary, who I'd spoken to maybe once, and who struck me as someone trapped in a situation she hadn't fully agreed to. On Karen's right was Tom Bradshaw, vice president, retired dentist, the kind of man who nods a lot and means nothing by it. And at the far end, looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet, was Ray Salinas, the newest board member, who I happened to know coached Little League with one of my deputies. Ray caught my eye when I walked in. He didn't wave. He just gave me a look that said, "Brother, I am so sorry about what's about to happen." Karen had prepared. I'll give her that. She had a projector set up, a laptop open, and a stack of printed materials at each board member's seat. There was even a small podium with a microphone, which was absurd for a room that size but consistent with everything I'd come to understand about how Karen experienced the world. She called the meeting to order at 7 sharp, read the minutes from the last session, acknowledged the quorum, went through the procedural motions with the kind of reverence usually reserved for parliamentary proceedings or church. Then she got to the single agenda item, and her voice shifted into something rehearsed and deliberate. The board has received multiple complaints regarding the property at 1 Ridgeline Drive, she began, and I watched her eyes find me in the 3rd row. Persistent and documented violations of community standards, failure to respond to formal correspondence, and a pattern of non-compliance that undermines the integrity of this association. Multiple complaints. I'd have bet my pension every single one of them originated from the same kitchen table where Karen Delacroix ate her breakfast. She clicked to the first slide, a photograph of my front gate taken from the road, then another of my tree line, then one of my workshop, shot from an angle that meant she'd been standing on the easement again. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and let her build her case. Someone who's been talking too loud finally stops. And not because they chose to, but because the air changed. I felt it in courtrooms. I felt it at accident scenes when the family arrives. It's the silence of a situation, rearranging itself around new information. I let it sit for a moment. Not because I'm dramatic, because I wanted every person at that table to feel the weight of what they just walked into. Then I reached into the folder I'd brought and pulled out my credentials. Set them on the table the way you'd set down a winning hand. Not slapped, not thrown, just placed where everyone could see. My badge, my county ID, my official letterhead from the sheriff's department, with my name and title printed clean across the top. Dale Hutchins, Sheriff, Barlow County. 12 years in that office. Before that, 14 years working my way up through the department. Before that, 4 years in the Marine Corps, learning that preparation isn't optional. I didn't mention any of that because I didn't need to. The badge said enough. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She looked like a fish that had just realized the water was gone. Gerald shifted in his chair and made a sound like he was clearing his throat, except nothing came out. The other two board members, Patty Nolan and a younger man named Steve, whose last name I never did catch, both leaned back from the table like the folder might bite them. Now let me be clear about something. I did not pull that badge to intimidate anyone. I pulled it because Karen Bellwether had spent the last 3 weeks implying to my neighbors, to the board, and in 2 separate written communications that I was some kind of reclusive problem resident who thought he was above the rules. She told Gerald I was hostile. She described me in her formal complaint as uncooperative and potentially threatening. Those words carry weight. She knew that when she chose them, so I wanted the room to understand exactly who she had been describing that way. I also pulled out the property survey from the county assessor's office. The one that showed, in clear black lines on white paper, that my property sits on an independent parcel that was deeded separately in 1971, a full 6 years before the Briarwood Estates development was platted. My land was never annexed into the HOA. It was never subject to their covenants. The developer who built the surrounding homes had tried to include my parcel in the original filing, and my grandfather, who owned it then, had refused. There was a signed exclusion document in the county records. I'd pulled a certified copy that morning. I set that on the table, too. Karen finally found her voice. "That's not," she started. She looked at Gerald. "That can't be right. Every property on this road is part of Briarwood." "Every property except one," I said. "Mine." Gerald picked up the survey, read it slowly, turned it over, like there might be different information on the back. There wasn't. I watched his face go through the stages. Confusion, recognition, then the particular expression of a man who realizes he's been led into someone else's fight and is now standing in the middle of it, holding the bag. "Karen," he said quietly, "you told me you verified the parcel inclusion." She didn't answer him. She was staring at me with an expression I'd seen before, plenty of times, on people who had been absolutely certain they were right and were now watching that certainty dissolve like sugar in hot water. It's not anger exactly. It's something closer to bewilderment. The world was supposed to work a certain way, and it just didn't. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The documents were doing all the talking, and documents don't get emotional. They just sit there being true. I had more in that folder, but I waited. Because I wanted someone to ask. I let the silence do the work for about 3 full seconds after I said it. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much until you're standing in a room full of people who just realized they've been poking a bear with a stick made of laminated complaints. Karen's mouth opened, closed, opened again. She looked like a fish someone had pulled out of the water and set on a boardroom table, which honestly wasn't far from the truth of the situation. Doug Fassler recovered first. He always was the steadiest of the bunch, even if steady in his case mostly meant slow to panic rather than quick to think. He cleared his throat and shuffled the papers in front of him like they might contain some instruction for what to do when the homeowner you've been citing turns out to be the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the county. Well, Doug said, that doesn't change anything, Karen said, and I have to give her credit for the sheer velocity of her denial. Most people, when they learn they've been filing frivolous complaints against someone who understands the legal system, the way a surgeon understands a rib cage, they take a beat. They recalibrate. Karen Bellwether did not recalibrate. Karen Bellwether doubled down. The bylaws are the bylaws. Your job title doesn't exempt you from community standards. You're absolutely right, I said. That stopped her shorter than my badge had. The bylaws are the bylaws, I repeated. So let's talk about them. Because I don't think you've actually read them, Karen. I think you've been operating off what you believe they should say, which is a very different document. I pulled the folder out of the bag I'd brought. I'd had my office administrator make copies because Denise has a gift for organization that borders on the spiritual, and because I knew this moment was coming the way you know rain is coming, when the barometric pressure drops and your bad knee starts talking to you. I laid out the original covenant documents, not the amended ones Karen had been waving around. The originals, recorded with the county clerk in 2003, which I had pulled myself because, and this is the part that really matters, the county clerk's office is literally down the hall from mine. Article 4, Section 2, I said. The covenant applies to lots within the planned subdivision designated as Phase 1 through Phase 3 of the Briar Creek development. My property is not part of that subdivision. It predates it by 46 years. The original plat map, which I also have a copy of right here, shows my parcel as a separate rural tract. It was never platted into Briar Creek. It was never subjected to the covenants. The developer built around me because my grandmother wouldn't sell, and God rest her, she was right not to. I set down the plat map. I set down the recorded covenants. I set down the county assessor's parcel designation, showing my property as unincorporated, rural residential, distinct and separate from every lot in Briar Creek. So when you tell me the bylaws are the bylaws, I said, looking directly at Karen now, I agree completely, and the bylaws don't apply to me. They never did. Every violation you filed is against a property that isn't in your jurisdiction. Every fine you levied is unenforceable, and every time you or anyone from this board set foot on my property to conduct an inspection you didn't have the authority to conduct, you were trespassing. The room had that particular quality of silence that happens. When people are doing math, they don't want to finish because they already know the answer is bad. Karen looked at Doug. Doug looked at the plat map like it might catch fire and save him from having to respond. Linda Choi, who hadn't said a word the entire meeting, quietly slid her chair about 2 inches back from the table, which I respected as the smartest tactical decision anyone on that board had made in months. Now, I said, and I sat back, and I let my voice get real quiet and real even, the way I do when I want someone to understand that what comes next is entirely up to them. Let's talk about what happens from here. The county board met on a Tuesday, which felt right. Tuesdays are honest days. Nobody schedules anything important on a Tuesday unless they mean it. I wore my uniform, not because I had to, because I wanted every person in that room to see exactly who Karen Delford had decided to go to war with. The badge sat on my chest like it always does. Not heavy, not light, just present. 31 years of presence. The boardroom in the county building smells like old carpet and coffee that's been on the burner since dawn. I've sat in that room maybe 1,000 times over the decades. Budget hearings, emergency declarations, the time we had to rezone half of Millbrook after the flood in '09. I know every water stain on those ceiling tiles. This was my house too, in a way that Karen would never understand about any place she lived. She showed up with a lawyer. Young kid, Couldn't have been more than 2 years out of law school carrying a leather portfolio that still had the department store shine on it. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I didn't blame him. When your client has sent fraudulent violation notices on county letterhead she fabricated herself, there's not a lot of legal ground to build your tent on. The HOA's actual attorney, a woman named Diane Prescott, who'd been handling community association law in this county for 15 years, sat on the opposite side of the table from Karen and wouldn't look at her. That told me everything about how the last week had gone behind closed doors. 3 board members had already resigned, the ones Karen had bullied into supporting her little campaign against my property. Turns out when you explain to reasonable people that they've been party to filing false code complaints against the sitting county sheriff using fabricated authority, reasonable people suddenly remember they have other priorities. The county attorney laid it out plain. The HOA's jurisdiction ended at the boundary markers filed with the original subdivision plat in 1991. My property was never included, was never annexed. The documents Karen had presented at that emergency board meeting were altered copies. Not even good alterations. She'd used a different font for the parcel numbers she added. A different font. Karen tried to speak twice. The first time, her lawyer put his hand on her arm. The second time, the county attorney asked her directly whether she wanted to make a statement on the record, given that the matter had been referred to the district attorney's office for review. Her lawyer whispered something. Watching someone come apart when they've done it entirely to themselves. That's not victory. That's just gravity. What I said when they gave me the floor was brief. I said that I had lived on that land for 23 years. That my wife and I had built our home with the intention of being left in peace and leaving others in peace. That I bore no ill will toward the homeowners association or its members, the vast majority of whom had never caused me a moment of trouble, that I hoped the community could move forward without further disruption. Then I drove home, took the long way, past the reservoir, windows down. October air has a specific weight to it in this part of the state, cool enough to remind you that summer is done making promises, warm enough to let you sit outside with your coffee in the morning without a jacket. I parked in my driveway, walked past the gate that had held her first letter, crossed my porch where she'd stood with her clipboard and her rehearsed authority, sat down in the chair where my wife would join me in a few minutes with 2 mugs, and nothing that needed saying, my property, my peace, my county. Some things don't need a fence to have a boundary